Hello to those of you just joining us. We're just letting people into this event, so bear with us for a minute or so until we're nice and full. Okay, welcome everybody. If you've just joined us, we'll wait a minute longer, I think, before commencing. Thanks for joining us today. We'll be back with you in a minute. Okay, more people are still coming in, but I think we'll make a start. Thank you to everybody for joining us on this Sunday afternoon for the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmaments Working for Peace in the Middle East online conference. We've got a number of speakers and contributors here with us today, and we'll be organised into three separate sessions. The first session, which will commence in just a few minutes, is Under Scrutiny, the UK in the Middle East, and speakers at that session will be Andrew Feinstein and Kate Hudson, who I'll introduce more fully in a moment. The second session, after a short break, we're very lucky to have a speaker from Israel and another from Iran, both active and members of the Middle East Treaty Organization, and that session is titled Voices from the Middle East, Can the Region Be Nuclear Free? And a final session with Lindsey German from the Stop the War Coalition and Sara Medi Jones, who's CND's campaign director, and this will be focused on campaigning for peace in the Middle East. When there is so much happening in the world and when attention is fixed in various points of contention, the issues in the Middle East and the issues of war and peace in the Middle East and nuclear weapons in the Middle East are of enduring importance. We all know from recent experience and recent history that these issues can flare up and disappear again and embed themselves in an ongoing set of issues, from the fate of the Iran deal or the JCPOA to the legacies of war and intervention in the Middle East, to the prospects for a weapons of mass destruction free zone and questions of why that hasn't yet been established in the Middle East, to the fate of the peoples of Palestine and the threats of future wars. All of these things are important for us to consider now, I believe, and we should be planning how we will respond, as well as the general dynamics of the situation. So without further ado, we'll begin our first session, Under Scrutiny, the role of the UK in the Middle East. Our first speaker in this session is Kate Hudson. She's an internationally known peace activist. She's the General Secretary of the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament. Our second speaker is Andrew Feinstein, who will be familiar to some of you. He's the Director of Shadow World Investigations. He's a peace activist and the author of Shadow World, Inside the Arms Trade, which is an essential read if you want to know some of the detail about what Britain and others are up to in the Middle East and elsewhere. So I'll hand over to Kate Hudson. Over to you, Kate.
Thanks very much indeed, Tom. And hello, everybody. Good to see you this afternoon. I'm going to start off with a bit of a historical look at Britain's role in the Middle East, and then Andrew's going to take it away over the contemporary role. So to start off by saying really that Britain's interests in the Middle East date back for centuries. In 1592, for example, the Levant Company was founded with a charter from Elizabeth I. She wanted Britain to maintain trade and political alliances with the Ottoman Empire and the Eastern Mediterranean. Over the centuries, Britain's interests particularly focused on maintaining naval control in the Eastern Mediterranean, on access to so-called British India, especially after the building of the Suez Canal in the 1860s, and in the 20th century, access to the oil fields of the Middle East and containment of Soviet political influence in the region. And essentially, I would say that it's a story of how the UK violently asserted control over other people's lands, expropriated their wealth and resources, suppressed their national sovereignty, and interfered in their national democracy as part of the West's regional and global strategic interests. Britain became most active in the region after the First World War, with the breakup of the defeated Ottoman Empire, which had been based in what is now Turkey. The Ottoman Empire had dominated the region, including southeastern Europe, for centuries. Two key agreements from this time shaped Britain's role in the Middle East. The secret Sykes-Pico Agreement of 1916, which was an Anglo-French agreement to divide up the Ottoman Empire between them after the war. Then there was the Balfour Declaration of 1917, which supported a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, without guaranteeing the political and national rights of the communities already living there. Britain seized Baghdad in 1917, and the newly formed state of Iraq became a so-called British mandate with governance based on British methods and personnel from its colonial rule in India. Important oil reserves were discovered in 1927, and the Iraq Petroleum Company was founded in 1929. Now, it may have been called the Iraq Petroleum Company, but actually it was owned by a consortium of British, French, Dutch, and American oil companies, and it was operated by the British until it was nationalised in 1972. The British ruled Iraq directly from 1918 to 1933, when formal independence was granted. After that, a compliant monarchy was installed, with Britain controlling the oil. Eventually, in 1958, the whole corrupt setup in Iraq ended in a nationalist army revolt, and a republic was declared. Similar Western intervention took place in Iran, most shockingly with the overthrow of the government of Mohammad Mossadegh in 1953 in a coup that was orchestrated by MI6 and the CIA. Mossadegh was the democratically elected Prime Minister of Iran, who introduced a range of social and political reforms, including the nationalisation of the Iranian oil industry, which had been run by the British through the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, later known as British Petroleum, or BP. The oil was one clear motivation, but the other was US suspicions that a secular Democrat would orientate towards the Soviet Union rather than the West. So Mossadegh was overthrown. He was widely regarded, and still is, as the leading champion of secular democracy and resistance to foreign domination in Iran's modern history. And his violent overthrow led to the brutal autocracy of the Shah, kept in place by US backing until his subsequent overthrow in the Islamic Revolution in 1979. In 2013, interestingly, the US government formally acknowledged the US role in the coup. This was pretty much typical behaviour of both the US and UK, and I'm sure people can think of other examples around the world of that kind of intervention. Basically, there were two contradictory forces at work against Britain in the post-Second World War period. On the one hand, the struggle for independence in the region and the growth of the Pan-Arabist movement, and on the other, the US's determination to kick the UK aside and replace its dominant role in the region. The key blow to UK interests in the Middle East came in 1956 at the hands of both of these forces. President Nasser of Egypt nationalised the Suez Canal. Britain, France, and Israel invaded, intent on reversing the nationalisation and restoring British and French control of the canal, which was their crucial route to the Middle and Far East. The US, however, had no intention of allowing these countries to restore their colonial control in the area. It had every intention of dominating the region itself, as was seen by its behaviour in countries such as Iraq and Iran. At this time, both Britain and France were dependent on the US economically since the Second World War, and the US pulled the plug. Both the British and French economies went into crisis, and their colonial adventure was defeated. A number of lessons were learnt, however. Israel learnt that the US was the most powerful ally it could have and turned definitively towards the US. Britain learnt that it could not afford to go against the US, but nevertheless experienced a major sense of betrayal over Suez. This actually led the British government to start making overtures towards cooperation with other European countries. And when Macmillan replaced Anthony Eden as Prime Minister in 1957, he made the first approach towards joining the European Economic Community. The Suez Crisis was a great humiliation for the British government. The empire was on its way out as the wind of change was blowing through Africa and through former colonies elsewhere. And it had a big impact on British society too, as people looked to break with the old order. And of course, CND, founded in 1958, was part of that changing society. So, to conclude, subsequent British interventions in the Middle East were very much on the coattails of the US. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kate. I should have said in my introduction that we will be using the Q&A function throughout this session this morning and in subsequent sessions. So if you do have a point you want to raise or a question you want to ask, please put it in the Q&A. It will be monitored throughout. Our next speaker, who I've already introduced, but I'll introduce him again for our latecomers, is Andrew Feinstein, Director of Shadow World Investigations, peace activist, and author of Shadow World Inside the Arms Trade. Many thanks for joining us today, Andrew. Over to you.
Thanks so much, Tom, and thank you to CND for the invitation. It's always a great pleasure to speak at CND events. Thank you also to all of you for being here to discuss and think about ways forward on this incredibly important topic. I want to talk about the UK's modern role in the Middle East from the background that Kate has so brilliantly described for us. The reality is that the Middle East is an absolutely key component of Britain's global foreign policy. And this is a foreign policy that is led primarily by arms sales. So we have the reality that if we look at the UK's role in the region, in the post-World War II period, particularly in the period from the 1970s, what we see is that the United Kingdom has sold probably more weapons than anyone else, even the United States of America, into the region. And we're talking here about weapons that are valued at tens of billions of pounds. Now, of course, the most obvious consequence of this is that these weapons, which cause the deaths of around 500,000 people a year around the world, are going to ensure that our foreign policy is driven by conflict rather than diplomacy and peacemaking. In addition to which, these arms sales are blighted by deep and systemic corruption that is absolutely crucial in why they continue on the one hand, but also why so many regimes in the Middle East remain profoundly ademocratic or anti-democratic and the major abusers of human rights. And to understand this dynamic, it's really important to consider that when we speak of corruption in the global arms trade, a trade that counts its profits in the billions and its costs in human lives, we have to remember that it is not only the buyers who are being corrupted. There exists something called the feedback principle in the global trade in weapons. And what this means is that when a company like BAE Systems, with huge support from the British government, from number 10 Downing Street, from Buckingham Palace in the form of Prince Andrew over many decades and his friend Jeffrey Epstein, some of these bribes actually return to the United Kingdom, rewarding the executives of the defense companies, the politicians, either directly and personally, and or through very generous donations to their political parties, also benefit materially from these arms sales. So Lawrence Wilkerson, a former colonel in the Marines, former chief of staff to General Colin Powell in the United States, talks about a global national security elite of senior politicians, senior military leaders, senior corporate executives, and a whole range of intermediaries, from the sort of dodgy arms dealers that are the stuff of Hollywood films to the world's biggest banks, law firms, auditing firms, and consulting firms, all benefit financially from these arms sales. In the United Kingdom, we need only think of the case of Tony Blair, salesperson in chief for BAE Systems, who has made tens of millions of pounds personally from Saudi Arabia, from companies who benefited from the UK's role in the invasion of Iraq, acting, and I would say this in far less polite terms than Kate, acting as America's poodle in the region. Tony Blair, unfortunately, was not the first leader nor the last to benefit from arms sales into the Middle East. In the case of Margaret Thatcher, on the most corrupt commercial transaction in history, the Al-Yamamah deal between Britain and Saudi Arabia, in which £6 billion of bribes were paid, Mark Thatcher, the Prime Minister's son, received a bribe of £12 million. The main intermediaries on that deal also happened to be amongst the Tory party's biggest individual donors. And this is a situation that continues. So these arms deals not only cause death, destruction, and immiseration in the Middle East, play an incredibly important role in the political status quo in the region, but they deeply corrode and corrupt our democracy in the United Kingdom itself, because it is worth bearing in mind that these arms deals, that the criminality in these arms deals seem to be above the law. Tony Blair closed down the investigation into the Al-Yamamah arms deal and its £6 billion of bribes. Now, the reality is that these states in the Middle East are states of what I now describe as states of militarized corruption. If we look at Saudi Arabia, these massive arms deals, primarily with the UK and the US, are the mechanism by which the Saudi ruling family moves money from the state fiscus in Saudi Arabia into private offshore accounts all over the world. In the United Kingdom at the moment, we have both main parties crying for war against Russia in relation to the Ukraine. And we are told by the leaders of both political parties that they are calling for war in pursuit of democracy, freedom, human rights, and territorial integrity. Let us consider those motivations in the Middle East for a moment. Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Israel, Bahrain, and so many more. These are the people to whom we are selling weapons in the Middle East. Do any of them in any way not undermine democracy, freedom, human rights, and territorial integrity? And it would be amiss of me to not mention here Britain's support for Israel in the apartheid it practices within its own country, but also its brutal and illegal occupation of Palestine. But our weapons sales are promoting democracy, freedom, human rights, and territorial integrity. Let me turn in the couple of minutes I have left to one of the most important examples of the remarkably malignant role that the United Kingdom plays in the Middle East, the conflict in Yemen. Britain has sold tens of billions of dollars worth of weapons into Yemen, where around 20,000 civilians have been killed, not as collateral damage, as is so often the case in conflicts, but intentionally targeted, predominantly by the Saudi and UAE coalition, which we arm. Every week, as declassified UK have revealed, a transport plane takes off from the Wharton airbase in Middle England with its latest supplies to Saudi Arabia for use in Yemen. So as bombs and missiles are dropped on the innocent civilians of Yemen, we are replenishing those stocks to enable further civilians to be murdered. The United States and the United Kingdom could stop the conflict in Yemen tomorrow by halting their arms sales to Saudi Arabia and the UAE. And for those who think that Saudi and the UAE would simply buy their weapons elsewhere, unfortunately, or fortunately probably, that is not how the global trade in weapons works. It takes decades to rebuild a supply chain to be able to provide maintenance and after-sales service to the planes that are dropping the bombs and missiles, to be able to actually buy bombs and missiles that those planes can utilize. We can talk more about that fallacy if you'd like to in the Q&A. So let us just think about this for a moment. For almost 7 years now, the United Kingdom has actively armed Saudi Arabia to continue to kill intentionally targeted civilians in Yemen. We are complicit in violations of international humanitarian law. We are complicit in war crimes being committed with our weapons. And what this shows is that the system of arms export controls that we on paper have in the United Kingdom, the United States, and Europe have failed. They are simply not fit for purpose. So let me reiterate where I started. We have in the Middle East a foreign policy driven primarily by arms sales. It is an absurd foreign policy where we sell the majority of our weapons to those countries that are the biggest ideological supporters of, financiers of, and often weaponizers of the very groups we were supposedly engaged in a war on terror against for many decades. But those who could change the rules of engagement, who could change the rules of our foreign policy, who could change the rules of our arms exports, are those who are benefiting from those arms sales. So it is going to be up to us, active citizens, activists, campaigners, and organizations like CND to put a stop to this madness that every day is costing human lives. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you, Kate, for your earlier contributions. Unusually for a CND webinar, we have not yet got questions appearing in the Q&A or even in the chat. So if we can we bring Kate back in as well, Sara, or whoever's controlling the oh, we've got one question in the Q&A. Okay. And this is for Andrew. So this is from Ray Street. Thank you, Ray. So she writes, thank you, Andrew, for your clear and damning presentation of arms sales. Thinking of the Yemen, for example, are not the mainstream media at fault too? So that's one for Andrew. And I was going to make a point and ask both of the speakers to respond to a bit more of the history, really, because Kate outlined how the role of the West, and I'll use that as an umbrella term for primarily the UK and the US working hand in hand in the overthrow of Mossadegh and then the installation of the Shah in Iran. It's interesting, I think, to note that, you know, arms sales play a feature, for instance, in contemporary issues and tensions between the UK and Iran, not least those who were kept imprisoned by the Iranian government. You know, there was an outstanding issue of an arms sale that was never fulfilled, involving hundreds of millions of pounds. And then we go from selling huge amounts, the British and US governments go from selling huge amounts of armaments to the Iranian regime to switching then to selling them to the Iraqi government in terms of their conflict with their decade-long or further conflict between Iraq and Iran. And so, you know, I take Andrew's point that, you know, if you look at the choices that are made by the West in terms of who they're selling armaments to, it seems to be, you know, money is being made, sharp interventions are being made through the sales of huge quantities of arms, but, you know, trying to find a consistency and approach, you know, a longer term consistency and approach of who is supported, who is armed, that seems to be missing. So I just wanted to put the point to Andrew really about, you know, what else other than arms sales is driving this foreign policy in the Middle East? Because I suspect there might be other things going on, you know, in terms of informing the choices. So I wondered if you could say a bit more about that. So I'll bring Kate and Andrew back in on those 2 points. The first from Ray on the role of the media, and then my slightly more rambling point about the choices that are made in terms of who is armed and what that tells us about the politics. So go for it.
So Kate, shall I have the first stab and you then add to it? I think Ray makes an absolutely crucial point. We have, for generations, seen, in my opinion, the traditional media fail us when it comes to issues of war and peace, when it comes to conflict. In the film that was made of the Shadow World book, a wonderful academic called James Dederian at Brown University at the time spoke about the military-industrial entertainment complex. And he included in that the mainstream media and Hollywood. And if one sees the sorts of way in which war is portrayed, in which war is covered, think back to the film Captain Phillips, which at the time the producers asked me to review with Tom Hanks. And after I'd seen the film, I said to them, well, all the film seems to be to me is an indication of how completely extreme US and UK militarism has become, because here you have these two very scrawny Somalian, supposedly people trying to hijack a boat with each with a rusty AK-47. And the US dispatches an aircraft carrier and 2 frigates to get this ship back. And in fact, the real story was that Captain Phillips, the character played by Tom Hanks, was hated by his crew because he was cowardly and hid when these 2 Somalis actually set foot on his boat. So the sort of distortion of the reality of our world and the ways in which war is presented as this heroic enterprise with a focus on the bravery of one side and the ignoring of victims on the other side. And I think that if we in the United Kingdom, people in the United States and around the world actually saw on a daily basis on our screens the human consequences of our arms sales, of our warlike foreign policy in the Middle East and elsewhere in the world, I think far more people in our countries would realize the brutality, the awfulness of what is being done in our names using our tax pounds. Because we should never lose sight of the fact that all of these functions, including the military function, are funded by us, the taxpayer. To sound slightly more hopeful on that issue is the fact that we do now have this myriad alternative media. And here I would strongly encourage people to look at platforms like Declassified UK, Open Democracy, Middle East Eye, and a number of others who are producing cutting-edge journalism on the real impacts of Britain's foreign policy and arms sales into the Middle East. I'm going to be very brief on your point, Tom, because I'm sure Kate will have a lot more informed input to make on it. I would just like to highlight one case, which is that of Nazanin Zagari Radcliffe, who has been detained, held hostage effectively in Iran for well over 5 years now because of the arms deal that you mentioned. International arbitration determined that Britain owed Iran a significant sum of money that was paid by the Shah of Iran in the last months of his dictatorship. The weapons that he thought he was buying were never delivered because the revolution took place. And so Iran has been trying to get this money back and took the United Kingdom to mutually agreed international arbitration, which ruled against the UK, but the UK simply refuses to pay the money back. And my organization made a submission to the Foreign Affairs Committee in Parliament, in which we outlined the dangers of the British arms trade in its corrupt, murderous nature for British citizens, and Nazanin and many others are very sadly examples of this. And very quickly to say, my own instinct is that we, the UK, the US, what you refer to as the West, are supporting an attempt that is being led by primarily Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Israel for regime change in Iran. That, to me, underpins so much of our foreign policy in the Middle East of recent years.
Thank you, Andrew. Kate?
Yeah, thanks. Yes, I very much agree with Andrew, and particularly thinking about going forwards in terms of our campaigning and so on. I think that making the most of alternative forms of media is absolutely crucial, but also, as well as just responding to stuff, which is very important. And, we have limited resources, so sometimes all we can do is respond. I think we need to really put work into challenging these new and baseless narratives that are being put out. And as I'm a historian by profession, but I'm sure we've all seen revisionist history proliferating and abounding in virtually every kind of sector. So you have a situation where, maybe in the past 30 or so years, there was some kind of working towards a more kind of people-based understanding, a less kind of, ruling class and capitalist-based understanding of what actually goes on in society. So we're seeing a kind of a rewriting of these histories. And what we also see, particularly shockingly, is a tendency towards rehabilitating colonialism. For a while, it was, bad. Everyone understood it was bad. And then now it's a kind of, these states fail. It's better if we can go in and help them and all that kind of thing, really kind of terrible colonial paternalistic mentality. But once you drill down into these situations, you see that why are these states in problems? Because of Western intervention. Why did so many newly independent countries after colonial liberation have economic problems? Because their economies were intervened in by places like the US and the UK, and the imposition of structural adjustment policy. So you wreck their economy and then you lend them loads of money and then you have to go in and sort them out. A kind of absolutely disgraceful situation. And I just touch on the two particular elements. The top significance of the arms trade, absolutely crucial. But looking back, I think it's still the case also today. One, the geostrategic significance of this region. Looking at a map, you can see how it's a kind of crossroads, so to speak, between so many different areas. For trade and so on. Between on the Eurasian landmass, massive thing, and Africa. So a kind of crossroads there, but also particularly in the 19th and 20th centuries with the kind of links to empire. So a kind of not only a trade and some good crossroads, but also a kind of bad crossroads in terms of facilitating imperial domination. And then also, the oil thing, absolutely fundamental. And I was looking back about this to see when when Britain first got involved with Middle Eastern oil. And it struck me that Winston Churchill had a big role in this, because in 1908, I think it was, when they were building new battleships in Britain, he decided to move from coal-based power on the battleships to oil-based power on the battleships. And so as a result of that, then there was the setting up of, a year later, Anglo-Persian Oil Company. And just a few years after that, Britain secured the controlling interest in that. So the kind of industrial, not just the military, but the kind of military-industrial complex already operating very, very centrally. And then, of course, you get the US coming on stream in 1933, developing that special relationship with the Saudi royal family, who gave them access to the oil. So that kind of, I think I can't remember who made that really fantastic film about the Bush family and the Saudi royal family, explaining that and how that continues into the 21st century. These links have been there for a very, very long time and have really shaped stuff. Maybe it seems like behind the scenes, but it's not actually, because it affects everybody's everyday lives. And in terms of recommending further reading, there's a great book. It was written some while ago, but in order to understand the whole US oil thing in the Middle East, it's called The Prize by Daniel Yergin, the Pulitzer Prize-winning author, and that really unpacks that whole relationship between the US and the Saudi royal family that underpins so much stuff, including Yemen, of course, today.
Okay, thanks both for that. We've got questions coming in. to the Q&A. I find it difficult, if not near impossible, to keep my attention across the speakers, the chat, and the Q&A. But I think I may have seen some questions being put into chat. If you could put those into Q&A, it helps my tiny brain to keep track of what's going on. So, question from Linda Rogers. So how can the UN human rights legislation be used to hold the UK to account? And there's a follow-up to that. On the other side, human rights should stop sanctions against Iran and the use of nuclear weapons, surely. So I think that's basically about a question about the overall role of the United Nations in what's been happening in the Middle East. And then a question from Mike in Aberdeen. The way in which the UK, US are currently intervening in the affairs of Ukraine is somewhat similar as to how they've intervened in the Middle East to create chaos. Do you agree with this? Fraternal greetings from Aberdeen. So what's the UN doing? Not restricted to the particular point that was made, and again on the similarities between the build-up around what is happening in Ukraine and the echoes of what we saw 21 or more years ago. So, Andrew, do you want to come first on these?
Sure, thank you very much for the questions. Between the Q&A and the chat, there are all sorts of very interesting points that have been made, including I'd just like to highlight one which is mention of David Waring's work, a book called Anglo-Arabia that I would recommend everyone to read. Also a book by Nicholas Gilby called Deception in High Places, about Britain's relationship with Saudi Arabia, and particularly its arms-based relationship. In terms of the UN, so I'm one of those people who believes that the world is a better place with the UN than if we didn't have it, but that the UN is at many levels failing. And why do I say this? Well, let's look at the conflict in Yemen. The UN set up a series of expert panels on Yemen, which is where we received the information about the ways in which Saudi and the UAE-led coalition primarily is targeting schools, hospitals, places of residence, places of worship, places of work. And Saudi Arabia, putting pressure on its allies, including the United States and the United Kingdom, have now stopped those expert panels. They no longer exist. And that was simply due to Saudi pressure. Now, if the UN was functioning optimally, that shouldn't be possible. So I think on this matter, on the matter of war and peace, while in certain instances UN peacekeepers have played an important role, I think overall that the UN is failing, that the UN is allowing, particularly its Security Council members, to engage in a free-for-all when it comes to conflict and war. And I think that's a great shame. The UN Human Rights Commission, which has been under enormous pressure from mainly the US for many years, a fellow South African, Navi Pillay, who was the commissioner for a few years, led a superb review into Israel and Palestine, and lost her role as a consequence. So nobody who now has stepped into that role subsequently will touch the subject. And so I think that we are seeing the UN become so dominated by particularly the Western countries that in terms of our own warmongering, the US is doing very little in that regard. And the United Nations International Arms Trade Treaty, which came into force in 2014, is unfortunately an incredibly weak treaty that has no meaningful enforcement mechanisms and has actually seen a situation where the trade in weapons, if anything, has got worse. Just very quickly, let me make a quick comment. There have been two queries about the Ukraine. Is it not very similar to the way the West behaves in the Middle East? And also there was the question in the chat about how UK arms sales in any way come into the situation in the Ukraine. I mean, very simply, just as politicians often use conflicts or the threat of conflicts to distract from dire political circumstances, and Boris Johnson and Joe Biden would both be cases in point here, just as Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher were when Grenada was invaded and when the Falklands conflict happened. So conflict is very valuable to political leaders, and often on both sides of the conflict. And we should never lose sight of that. Boris Johnson has tried to use the tensions between Russia and the Ukraine, not only to present himself as some sort of war leader, and I ask you to think back to that image of Margaret Thatcher driving a tank with a helmet on her head that was so important to her politically. I mean, it might have actually saved her political career in the sort of early 80s. Boris Johnson would probably be upside down if he tried to do the same photograph or something similar. It wouldn't surprise me. But I think that's a very important consideration. And then just the understanding, and I'm sorry to constantly return to the economics here, but of the crucial role of the Prime Minister and the President in the United States of America in promoting conflict, so that the defense companies who oil the wheels of our political systems, as I outlined, continue to rotate and continue to generate money. So, you know, absurdly, Boris Johnson announced that the United Kingdom would be sending 100 man pads, which are sort of surface to surface or surface to missile launchers that you can carry to the Ukraine. The Ukraine was the arms factory of the Soviet Union and has more military equipment than it could ever need. So this was just an attempt to bring the British arms trade into the conversation about the tensions in Russia and Ukraine. So of course, this is always, whenever there is conflict, there is this thought of this is good for our companies. And the chief executive, my last point, the chief executive of Raytheon, the company supplying more bombs and missiles from its factories in the UK, even though it's an American company, into the Yemen conflict, actually said at the AGM just a few weeks ago how brilliant the outlook is for the company and its shareholders because of what's happening in the Middle East, because of the tensions in Russia and Ukraine. They are literally sitting there, rubbing their hands and licking their lips at the prospect of murder, mayhem, and immiseration.
Thank you, Andrew. Kate.
Thanks very much. Yes, just a couple of points in response to those questions. Firstly, around the UN. I mean, like Andrew, I think the world is a better place for having it. I mean, but the problem is that all its incredible potential and the will of the overwhelming majority of states signed up to it, you know, Global South in particular, you know, that is just regularly ridden roughshod over by the most powerful countries, in particular the nuclear weapons states there. So if you look at the Middle East in particular, the work over the past decades for weapons of mass destruction free zone in the Middle East, which is sort of ongoing work, boycotted by Israel and the US, for example. So that's good work being done, demands being made by the UN, but not coming to fruition because of this kind of bypassing and boycotting. Similarly with UN resolutions on Palestine, you know, being ignored and so on. But I think having them there as a kind of benchmark is a positive thing. I mean, the same when it comes to the question of nuclear weapons. The UN has ratified and now enforced the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. So that's come into international law. Unfortunately, the nuclear weapons states are boycotting and bypassing it, you know, but nevertheless, the fact that it's there is a very, very positive thing. So, yeah, I mean, another example, I mean, obviously relevant to the Middle East situation, is the way in which the US and its allies in 2002, you know, were trying to claim that they could go to war on Iraq on the basis of UN resolution, was it 1991 or whatever it was, you know, that at the time, and they weren't, it was illegal, you know, but unfortunately, because it was illegal, they just bypassed it and created their coalition of the willing. You know, that's absolutely typical. So the UN, good, but you know, there needs to be some way of holding these countries to account. Otherwise, you can have all the nice legislation and so on that you like, great, but it's not going to make a vast amount of difference. So that's one thing. And then with regards to Mike Martin's point, I don't really agree with the way you frame that. It's gone now from the list, so I can't really quote you exactly, but you said something like, they had the intention of creating chaos in the Middle East, and are they doing the same going in Ukraine? I don't accept really that, or don't understand it as the US and so on trying to create chaos in the Middle East. They were actually trying to take control of the Middle East and reassert their hegemony in the Middle East, and get oil and stuff as well at the same time, But the chaos ensued in many areas because of the failure of their intervention and the resistance by the populations to that taking place, So, and I don't think they're trying to create chaos in Ukraine. I think they're trying to get Ukraine into their orbits, more firmly and get it into NATO, So it's like you go for non-compliant states or something like that, and try and get them into your framework, have tame leaders, and then Bob's your uncle. You've kind of cemented the further encroachment of US hegemony and Western interests.
Okay, many thanks, Kate. And by way of your comments there, you answered, I think, the point that Steve Bell has made in the Q&A, where he writes, isn't it the case that UK policy in the Middle East is driven primarily by assisting in the maintenance of US hegemony? Certainly, this is the formal position in the Global Britain documents and endorsed by the current Labour leadership. Arms sales are important, but not decisive in that context. And it is worth, for those of you who haven't availed yourself of the opportunity to read all of the stuff, pages and pages and pages of stuff on Global Britain that the Foreign Office and others put out, it's worth dipping your toe into, because they are quite blatant about what all this means. It's Britain astriding the world again, hand in hand or arm in arm with the US, as Kate described it, and it's laid out there fully, also in terms of the crass hypocrisy of the UK's approach to arms control, for instance, and the nuclear question in terms of the Middle East. I mean, the recent submissions from James Cleverly and others to the Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference, I mean, it's full of shameless lies in terms of their attitudes towards these questions. So it is worth looking at what they're saying and drawing the conclusions informed by all of the stuff that CND and the other sources here have to say. Kate, I can see you. Go on.
I just highly support what you're saying about reading that Global Britain document. If you want to understand, the Johnson government's strategic approach, just read that. I mean, it's completely clear. But there's a kind of an adjunct document to that, the integrated review, which is all about, arms sales. I'm sure Andrew is very familiar with it, and it's just like an advert, for Britain's arms sales. I mean, it's absolutely shameless, but well worth reading.
You can perhaps put those up in the chat later. Andrew, come on, unmute yourself. Yeah.
Hi, yeah, sorry, you'd think after over 2 years I'd be a bit better. But just to add to the points that Kate has made and to the comment from Stephen, which I think is a very instructive one. Of course, there are many factors driving this, of which the economics of the arms trade is certainly one. But yes, hegemony, natural resources, fossil fuels in particular, et cetera, these are all absolutely crucial. The one thing that I want to re-emphasize, though, is that what all of these things do, they're all underpinned by a particular militarism. And it's a militarism that suggests that the way to resolve any dispute is through conflict rather than diplomacy. And it manifests in our societies in so many different ways. Our obsession with war, we have wars on everything. We have wars on COVID, we have wars on various other health conditions. I mean, you see people using this sort of nomenclature constantly. And it's just instructive to bear in mind that the United States of America in whose coattails, as many people, particularly Kate, have pointed out today, on whose coattails we effectively ride when it comes to foreign policy. The United States of America has more people running and maintaining one aircraft carrier than it has diplomats across the entire world. And today, the United States of America has 12 aircraft carriers. So I think, you know, there are a myriad factors that lead to this, but this underlying militarism and the monies that it generates for those who effectively set the policy agenda is an incredibly important dimension that we should not lose sight of in any way. And this applies, you know, obviously across the board, conventional weapons, nuclear weapons, et cetera, et cetera. It's what C. Wright Mills described as the military metaphysic, where the lens through which you see everything in the world is a militarized one. And I think that is the state that we find ourselves in the so-called West. And it's a confluence of factors, but key amongst those factors, and why I think we unfortunately can't look to political leaders for solutions to these issues, is because they are the ones who are benefiting both politically and economically from this mindset.
Thank you, Andrew. Very strongly put. And, you know, as a, you know, militarism and the military does pop up everywhere. It wasn't that long ago that I had to take down an army recruitment banner that was hung up near my son's primary school. The council refused to have it removed, so someone helped them with their particular problem, but it infects and infests everything. Just before I ask our contributors to sum up, I wanted to kind of ask a question, a direct question basically, about, you know, what should the peace and anti-war campaigners be looking out for in terms of developments, specific developments in the Middle East? What are the risks on the horizon? What are the situations developing that we may need to respond to in short order, and, you know, why are they coming about? That's fairly broad, but you may well have particulars in mind, and then I'll ask the presenters to sum up. Okay, who would like to go first with that? Kate.
Okay, well, yes, I don't want to say too much about this, because I know that in the next session we've got our Middle Eastern activist experts, you know, but I mean, in terms of what's going on in the Middle East, two absolutely key things are the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, and that's because of all the intense focus in the British media about trying to ramp up war with Ukraine, tragically, which is pretty much what it's like, that has dropped out of the news. But ensuring that or the resumption of that deal on a fair basis, I mean, that has to be fundamentally important. And I know that will be covered in the next session, as will the other point of central interest. I mentioned WMD-free zone in the Middle East. Now, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference, which is where those developments come back to, that was supposed to happen last month, couple of years ago, actually. But that's probably going to be taking place this summer. And that is where the latest developments will come back to the international community, you know, on that work towards denuclearizing the Middle East. And so we need to keep an eye out on that as well. So those two things, the Iran nuclear deal and the WMD-free Middle East developments, those are absolutely fundamental. But if I could just, in concluding, you know, just come back to the point that I made before about us really stepping up the detailed analytical work that we do, you know, and getting that out there, because it's one thing to tweet some good sounding slogan or have a little blog about these issues, but in-depth work on these things, you know, maybe it's out there already. I know Declassified does do stuff, but maybe if it's out there, let's get that shared about. But if it's not out there, let's support the organisations and the kind of really progressive think tanks that will do this work, so we can be countering the lies and the misinformation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kate. Andrew?
Very quickly, for the reasons Kate said, I think the next session will deal with some aspects of this. But for me in the Middle East, the things that stand out is the fact that Israel and its occupation, there are clearly concerted attempts to give Israel a free pass. And I think Israel's role, not just in the Middle East militarily, but in the global military infrastructure, is an absolutely crucial one. And it should certainly not be getting a free pass, just as Britain, the United States, Saudi Arabia, the UAE shouldn't get a free pass on any of this either. And unfortunately, it feels like we do some of the times. Obviously, the conflicts in Yemen. January saw the highest civilian death toll in 5 years in Yemen. And if you look at our media or look to our politicians, you would think the conflict no longer exists. So I think keeping a focus on the conflict in Yemen and our complicit role in violations of international law and commission of war crimes is crucial. And then I would say the figure of the Saudi Arabian Crown Prince, MBS, who, we've sort of forgotten that he was responsible for the murder and chopping up of the journalist who wrote critically about his regime, and where he is very different to most of his predecessors, who have all bought tens of billions of dollars worth of weapons from the US and the UK in time immemorial, is that he's using the vast majority of those weapons in Yemen and other places. The second thing I would say, just in concluding, is that we should also play an important role within the UK in rubbishing this notion of, because I think the current government and certainly the Labour front bench now see weapons makers as a key component of Britain's post-Brexit economy. But the reality is that weapons manufacture is an absolutely appalling way to generate jobs. It is incredibly expensive. For the same public investment, in each defense job, you could create between 3 and 7 jobs in much more economically and socially productive sectors. So looking at diversification out of arms into renewable energy, etc., and bearing in mind that our arms exports, which take up so much of our government's time, account for less than 2% of Britain's exports. So it really isn't a crucial industry in our economy. And then finally, I would say the linkage between the climate catastrophe and conflict. It'll surprise nobody to hear that the Pentagon is the largest single institutional polluter on the planet. And there are a whole lot of facts. I did a short piece on Double Down News just before COP26 that people might want to look at for some of those issues. And then to reiterate what Kate said, get involved in CND, get involved in campaign against arms trade. We try and support these organizations through the screenings of the Shadow World film, the War School film, through investigative methods training, so you can even look to investigate arms companies that are on your doorstep. So look at our work at shadowworldinvestigations.org, but get involved. Change in the sphere is not going to come from our politicians unless we put extreme amounts of pressure on them.
Thank you very much, Andrew. I'll reiterate the point that Andrew made there about getting involved with CND and other organisations, but I'm going to promote CND shamelessly here. If you are not already a member, then please do join. cnd.org/join is the URL link. If you are already a member, then please donate. Spread the word. Please do get others involved. This webinar, along with all of the other series of webinars with international speakers and domestic experts, they are available online. Share that information. These sessions have been a huge success and have enabled CND to build up a base of interest and support and knowledge that was there before, but not as explicit in what we were doing and saying. So thank you again to everyone who's attended so far, to Andrew and to Kate, and to those of you who've made points and asked questions. Our next session will start at 2:20. Voices from the Middle East. Can the region be nuclear free? go and make yourself a cup of tea or coffee or toast or whatever. Get yourself a biscuit and join us again at 2:20. But thank you very much, everybody, and we will see you soon.
Okay, I think we're ready to start again. So welcome back, everyone. After that really informative and very interesting discussion so far, I'm sure that will continue with the next couple of speakers. We've heard about the UK's role in all of this and the West's role. Now we're going to focus on voices from the Middle East. And we have two really important, extremely knowledgeable practitioners, activists, whatever you like to call them. First of all, Sharon Doliff, and then Emad. And they're both from the Middle East Treaty Organization, one from Israel, one from Iran. So we'll start, I think, with Sharon Doliff, who many of you will know because she has been at quite a number of CND meetings in the past on this particular issue. She's a peace and human rights activist with a focus on eradicating nuclear and other weapons of mass destruction from the Middle East. She's the founder and director of the Israeli disarmament movement, the co-founder of the executive director of the Middle East Treaty Organization, MITO, and an Israeli campaigner for the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons, ICAN. Sharon, it's wonderful to have you here. Thanks very much for coming. Over to you.
Thank you. It's great to be here, even via Zoom. Actually, it's better via Zoom. I get to sit in my own kitchen. First, I have to say that the last panel threw me out. I wanted to jump in so many times, so I hope that at the end I'll have the chance to say something about it. The question that was posed as the headline for this panel was, can the region be nuclear free? And I have to start with how much I resent this question. And the reason I resent this question is because, of course, the question is not, can the region be nuclear free? Why even pose it as a question? Of course, it can be nuclear free, just as much as Europe can be one day nuclear free. There's no difference. There are states here at this level. It's states that decide where they invest, where they are not investing, and what is the price for investing in this and not in that. That's it at the end. It's just states that need to give up on something that they don't want to give. And also when we're asking if the region can be nuclear free, we're actually not asking whether the region can be nuclear free. We're asking, can we disarm Israel? And again, this is a question that needs to be asked about all the 9 nuclear armed states. The fact is that I am working in Israel, I'm working in the Middle East, but of course the point is to have no longer nuclear weapons anywhere. And our responsibility, Emad and I, is how do we bring the region, on one hand, the one state that possesses them, to the table, and how do we keep the rest of the states in the Middle East where they are now when they're not pursuing or not succeeding in pursuing nuclear weapons. So that's actually the question. Now, if you look at the history of not the zone entirely, but just the conversation about weapons of mass destruction free zone or nuclear free zone in the Middle East, you can go back to 1974 when this question was brought up, but I'll go just to 95. And the reason I'm going to 95 is because I guess most of the people listening now know what the Non-Proliferation Treaty is, the NPT, signed in 1970, or coming into force in 1970. And in 1995, in a consensus vote, there was a need to make a decision on the Middle East in order to have the Arab states, the non-aligned movement, sign the extension of the NPT. The rest of the world needed to say yes to a nuclear weapon-free zone in the Middle East. And that was the beginning of, the way I see it, that was the beginning of, from the pool, from the jumper of the pool, not even doing it inside the water, but from the jumper to basically ruin the good faith. Because a decision on a nuclear-free Middle East, when Israel is not in the room and not abide by this decision, is a decision that can't happen. So when the states of the world promised the Arab world a nuclear weapon-free zone in 95, they promised something that they could not deliver on, and they knew that they cannot deliver on. And yet the conversation is still about a nuclear weapon-free zone in the Middle East when Israel is not part of the conversation. So if we're looking at possibilities for nuclear armed state, for nuclear free zone, in the Middle East, is basically how to bring Israel to the table and how to keep the rest of the states where they're at now, on one hand, which is not going for nuclear weapons, but also how do we bring a conversation that is successful. Now, in 95, this decision was made, and since then, every 5 years at the NPT, there's supposed to be a final document. In 2015, the states in the NPT couldn't reach a final document. The reason that they couldn't reach an agreement was mainly because of the nuclear armed states. By then, the humanitarian campaign was very strong. CND was part of that. ICANN was part of that, and activists, states, and bigger forces were talking about the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons and on the need of the nuclear armed states to talk about a timeline, to talk about what came afterwards as the TPNW, as a nuclear ban. And in 2015, it was obvious that the states in the room cannot reach an agreement. US, UK, and Canada found a solution, a very nice solution. If we can't have a final agreement, let's put it on the Middle East. And in the last 2 days, they decided that in the last 2 days of a 1 month meeting, they can solve the Middle East or not solve the Middle East. And by then, of course, put the blame on a non-final document on the one state that is not really in the room, and that's Israel. And the reason I'm saying it is not because I'm here to defend Israel, but I'm here to defend campaigns that work or things that might work, and not to continue the same rhetoric that makes everything as it is now, because as it is now, on one hand, is not acceptable, but also as it is now is just for now. Is it possible? And I think that this is the question, is it possible to see a nuclear arm race in the Middle East? And the answer to that is also yes, just as it is possible to see a nuclear and weapons of mass destruction free zone in the Middle East. In 2014, after 7 years of campaigning in Israel, I decided that it's time to look for the solution. Okay, we have a good story as campaigners. We need to have a good story. We have a good story to tell Israelis of why we need to get rid of nuclear weapons, why all 9 nuclear armed states needs to give up their nuclear weapons, why Israel is as part of these 9 states will have to give up its nuclear weapons. What we didn't have was a solution. In what conditions Israel will feel free or secure to give up its nuclear weapons, or what are the conditions that will bring Israel to the table? And then we decided to map what are the obstacles that are standing between us and a weapon of mass destruction free zone in the Middle East. When we mapped the obstacles from Israel regionally and internationally, we saw that one thing that was missing, and it might sound very hippie to you because it is very hippie actually, is that the vast majority of obstacles that we heard from diplomats, from activists, from international experts were all under the same column. No belief in the possibility, no goodwill in changing, not in changing the discourse, not in changing the demands, and not in opening up for the possibilities that are in order to disarm the zone. So mapping all the obstacles, and one of them is also very much related to what was discussed in the last panel, was that most people have a lot to gain, even if they're against nuclear weapons. The discourse is not changing. This is what we are used to say. Let's keep demanding that Israel will join the NPT, Israel will do this, Israel will do that. This is not a way to bring a state into the table. And somehow, and that's my problem, not with the states, but with the activists that were working on it globally, somehow activists thought that a language that will never work with their own state might work with Israel or with Iran or with Saudi Arabia. And of course, that never happens. I mean, when you talk to states, you need to talk to the same powers that are moving your own government. And if you don't see that, you don't have the right language. Now, when we looked at possibilities for the zone, and when we started to talk to the people in power in the zone, and when we realized that it's really a question of belief that it is possible, we started writing solutions to all the obstacles or the fears that were not just under no goodwill. We went to how do you look at the problem of trust between the states in the Middle East when they're not talking to each other? How do we create confidence building measures while disarming? How do we work on capacity building in the zone? And how do we create an organization outside of the zone, but close enough to the zone, which from that came the name of our organization, the Middle East Treaty Organization, for the states and for diplomats and for activists from this zone to look for solutions. And in order for them to think about solutions, we created a draft treaty. Now we are at our fourth draft. So the diplomats now looking at different possibilities for draft treaties, different possibilities for different problems in the Middle East, and suddenly, or not so suddenly, it took 3 or 4 years, we managed to change the discourse in vast majority of these rooms to not impossible, but which possibility do we choose? And the request that we had as activists was, please don't say it's impossible anymore. I mean, you can't say it's impossible anymore when you are discussing multiple choices that all are somehow might work. And this is also our requests when we are now talking to campaigners and diplomats outside of the zone. If you are dealing with the zone and you are not willing to look at possibilities, step back. If you are willing to believe that it is possible, and now the question is how we achieve it, then we have a conversation. Then we can have a conversation. One of the things that we discovered that was really problematic was the connection, of course, between disarmament in the Middle East and between peace issues, Israel-Palestine, the Abraham Accords, Saudi war. Sorry, I have to relocate. The Saudi, Iran fractions, and sadly, the way that the West was dealing with this issue. Because if we're talking about the way that the UK is involved, for example, in the Middle East, you can see that, yes, the US has boycotted the November conference room, which we'll talk a bit more later, but the UK was there. However, when the UK delivered their speech, they sounded very much closer to the Americans. I mean, when the British representative finished delivering his speech, my question for him was, could you say it in the accent was an American accent. So it was quite obvious that the UK in the room was not there to support the process. They were not there to support the November conference room, where the states from the zone supposed to find a solution for the zone, freely arrived at a text that they can all feel comfortable with. But actually the UK was there to put sticks in the wheels. And this is something that I think that CND should deal with when campaigning on the Middle East. I'll pass it to Emad now, if it's okay, and if necessary, we'll jump back and forth.
Okay, thank you very much, Sharon. Thanks a lot. Can I just remind people before we move to Emad that if you have any questions or answers, comments, whatever, please put them in the Q&A so we can deal with them later on. But now I'd like to introduce Emad Kiyaei. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. He's a director at the Middle East Treaty, Treaty Organization. Formerly, he was a researcher from Princeton University's Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs and an associate at Columbia University Center for International Conflict Resolution. He's also served as the executive director of the American Iranian Council, which is a non-profit and non-partisan educational organization. So he provided strategic consultation to a number of UN Security Council members during the Iranian nuclear negotiations. So really warm greetings to you, Emad. Thanks very much for coming. Now have your say. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks to the CND for the invitation. And it's always difficult in a very short time to discuss how do we make the Middle East new candidate in Cape Town. So I hope my internet connection is okay. Now, there are a lot happening, as Sharon said, in regards to the WMD free zone in the Middle East. In essence, the bottom line is that we will have 22 countries which are part of the Arab League, plus Iran and Israel, 24 countries, which will encompass this regional zone free from weapons of mass destruction. That's number one. So now we have a geography in our mind. Number two, it involves beyond nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons. For it to be established, we need these governments to agree on a treaty text freely arrived at. That's what's been negotiated in this annual UN-led conference on the zone, which brings these countries and the members of the UN Security Council and other observers institutions such as the IAEA, OPCW, and a handful of civil society organizations, which includes METO. And in the room in New York is where they are negotiating on this text. Now, as Sharon mentioned, the United States is not in the room, Israel is not in the room, but who? And the P4. So we know that there's actually a sizable amount of countries there negotiating in good faith in finding a way to establish this zone. So keep.
Emad, you're stuck.
Oh, I think we have a...
Number two, right at this moment.
You keep freezing, Emad, that's all. Just, we missed the last little bit. You froze.
Is my again. African connection, I'm so sorry.
That's okay.
Emad, maybe try to turn off your video, and if it won't work, I'll just take over. Sorry.
All right, can you hear me better now?
Yep, that's good so far. Thanks. Carry on.
Perfect. Let's try this again. So I will just say that for the zone, for WMD free zone to be established, right now there are some parallel tracks of discussions that are going on. One is within the UN, and that's the annual conference that happens every November now, that is discussing a freely arrived at consensus-based treaty text that then puts into place the framework, the meat, how do we verify, how do we monitor, how do we establish such a zone that has never been established before. We have nuclear weapons free zones. Those are great examples, but we never had a WMD free zone in the world. So the Middle East is going to be a new frontier for this such a zone that encompasses all WMDs. While that's happening in New York on an annual basis, run through the United Nations, there's of course what Sharon mentioned, the NPT track, that commitment to the indefinite extension of the NPT in 1995, that there will be some measurable progress on establishing the zone. Now there, of course, Israel is not party to the NPT. So it's going to be a complicated situation to even address the elephant in the room there. But we should not forget that that's also continuing. There is a third track. The third track is the JCPOA. We have an agreement between Iran and the world powers that places Iran's nuclear program under 24/7 watch with inspectors, monitors, and to make sure that Iran's nuclear program does not diversify or divert into weaponization. That document, that JCPOA deal that has been right now worked out to revive in Vienna between Iran and the other parties to the treaty, to the accord, is extremely important because it's not just about Iran. is not just about Iran. That agreement, the JCPOA, provides us a blueprint, 183 pages of measures that can take place to make sure other nuclear programs remain peaceful, that we can actually monitor, we can actually have our eyes and ears on what is going on in sovereign states' nuclear programs. So the same measures that Iran has agreed to, we can extend beyond Iran into the region. Fourthly, there is the civil society component. That's you and I, and Sharon, and all of us that are working on disarmament issues. And here again, Meto is at the forefront with our colleagues at UNIDIR, IPPNW, CND, ICANN, and others who realize the importance of keeping this idea of the WMD-free zone alive and to show the ways forward for it to become a reality through the draft treaty process, through capacity building, through campaigning, and also finding allies outside the region who can then come and help us in this adventure to make it move forward. What can we from the outside action this? But when we say that, let's talk with the Middle East. Let's actually not say that if we're talking at the Middle East is extremely important. And this is where Meto can help with the language, with the policies, with how we can advocate and campaign to make the zone a reality. My final word will be this, that in addition to WMD related issues that are going on in the Middle East is also moving forward on other political processes. As Sharon mentioned, the Abraham Accords, you have Iran-Saudi rapprochement that is being mediated through the Iraqis. You have discussions on what do we do about Yemen? What do we do about Syria and beyond? So there is other parallel diplomatic processes that when combined together, any progress on one will contribute to an overall push forward for the region to at least breathe and seek more peace and stability. And I hope that in our conversations and Q&A, we can go into more detail about what can be done. Thank you. And sorry about my connection.
Thank you very much, Emad. That's wonderful. It's good to hear and see so much enthusiasm and so much encouragement for us to go forward with this really important issue. I can see one question in the Q&A. That's from Jenny Clegg. To what extent might the confrontation between the US and Russia over the Ukraine impact on their cooperation in the JCPOA? The US and Russia both have their influence in the Middle East, and now China is beginning to develop its contacts. How are these outside powers impacting on dynamics within the Middle East?
Dave, I'll just take that quickly, if that's okay. The same issue, the animosity between US and Russia is not new. And when the negotiations for the JCPOA or Iran nuclear deal began in 2013 to 2015, there were other issues around the table amongst the parties that are negotiating. So there is conversations that are happening, but surprisingly, when we see the discussions in Vienna going on, and from what we hear from the Russians, from the Americans and others, the European Union and the Chinese delegations and the Iranians, there is progress made. In my humble opinion, I think that the fact that the US and maybe a breathing space for the negotiations in and actually reach a deal quicker, because and all the focus in Congress and in Washington and in Moscow has gone towards this dilemma over Ukraine. So I see it as an opportunity rather than a hindrance.
Great, thank you. Sharon, would you like to add anything to that?
Well, I have to say that of course, the Russian-American game over the Middle East, so connected to oil, and you discussed it in the last panel in much thorough way that I can contribute to this. But what I do want to talk about a little bit is when we ask things like, what can we do? What is it that CND can do, for example? One of the things that I've noticed is how much attention the Middle East is getting and how much activities are being done at talking at the Middle East, giving advice to the Middle East and so on. But if one thing that the last panel that I'm so happy that there's a recording of it. The last panel showed us is how much influence the UK actually has still on the Middle East. How much money is being spent on weapons from the Middle East to the Middle East, how much suffering is being caused by UK money. And yet when time for action comes, usually it's demands from Israel, demands from Saudi, more demands from Israel than demands from Saudi Arabia. And these voices, this energy is going towards basically like talking to the wall. I mean, Israel is not going to listen, not to this. When will Israel listen? And since it's so interesting for people, when will Israel listen? Israel will listen when it's forced to listen, just like South Africa did, just like the UK will. I mean, what will disarm the UK if we'll force the UK to talk about it to begin with? Now, when it comes to the Middle East, when it comes to money, and when it comes to policy, there's so much to be done inside the UK in order to stop the money that goes to the Middle East, but first and foremost, to change the language. I can give you a little fantasy that I would like to share about the campaign in Israel, because after many years of creating a regional solution for Israel to join, what is it that we are asking Israel to do now in the campaign is we're asking Israel to stop being afraid of talking, joining the table where there's a consensus. Now, the November conference, the November conference is how we call the UN conference on a weapons of mass destruction free zone in the Middle East, is a room where decisions are made by consensus. So if Israel is in the room now, Israel can actually have all the weight Israel would like to have when it comes to making decisions on how the text will look like. On the other hand, the Arab states that are in the room should make as much progress as possible while Israel is not in the room, because if every state can veto, then every state can stuck the progress. Now, if it was up to us, and since we're talking to CND, what we would have done is to put as much pressure on the UK foreign ministry to play a better role at the UN conference, to play a more responsible role at the UN conference by supporting the conference itself, but also by hosting one of the most important things that are about to happen this year, and that's the intersessional work. The states in the room, the Arab states and Iran, have decided that between sessions, they will have intersessional work. And that's where problems are going to be solved. The real problems are going to be solved. So our campaign outside of Israel is for states like the UK. CND, for example, you can host some of these off the record meetings, some of these track 1.5, track 2 meetings of people from the Middle East, while calling on your own government to show some more responsibility. I can say that in Israel, the campaign this year is going to focus mainly on the international campaign, because what we're going to say in the Israeli campaign is for Israel to join, but for Israel to join under a condition that all nuclear armed states will have to make one step forward. So all the nuclear armed states will have to say something like maybe a timeline, maybe a willingness to join talks on the TPNW and so on. So we don't just want Israel to join. We want Israel to join as part of a global move. And we're inviting you to think with us, what is it that you can do at the UK while we're doing in Israel or in the Middle East in order to make all the nuclear armed states move forward together? And for us, this is very important, because the last thing that will help Israel to join the table is isolating Israel. But to show to Israel that it's not alone. Israel is in the same place as 9 nuclear armed states, other nuclear armed states, and 5 other states that host NATO's weapon or American weapons on the ground. They're all in the same basket and they all need to move forward together. We think that this is successful for the campaign in Israel. Sorry to steal the question in order to talk about next steps.
No, that's fine. In fact, you answered the question that was in the Q&A, so from Linda Rogers, which she's just said, thank you for answering it. So good, thank you. There's another one from Kate. She couldn't put one on the Q&A, but put it in the chat. I think it's also relevant, and you may have already answered this to some extent. I don't seem, the UK participates in the WMDFZ meetings. Is it playing a good faith role in this?
So if Emad would like to contribute, sure. I can say that for what we saw now.
This one is good. This one is good. The way the British with the American accents, or
yeah, I mean, when the US at the NPT is reading their declarations, there's always one or two paragraphs that is with an Israeli accent. You can see that it was cut and paste from the Israelis that are not in the room. But when the UK was speaking at the November conference, they spoke in such a hard American accent that I could also almost hear the Israeli accent from behind. The time is not right, yada, yada. When is the right time for disarmament? When is the right time for nuclear proliferation, which is what we're facing? Now, the way that governments are gaining from the situation, we understand. The way that that the good doer, our people, campaigners are gaining from this situation is by, if I can understand why states behave the way that they behave, I find it a bit harder to understand why activists, why campaigns around the world are mimicking this language. And I can elaborate about this a bit. But when it comes to the UK role, it's better to not have the UK in the room than to have the UK in the room right now. Because in this room, you see the one thing that was supposed to happen. The Middle East states sitting in the middle of the room, and the four nuclear armed states are sitting in the periphery of the room, as they should have. This is a conference about the Middle East and for the Middle East. It's part of the fact that the US, France, UK, and China and Russia are playing with the Middle East. They don't have a role in this room. The role that they have in this room is to respect the process. There is a process, and it's our role as activists around the world is to protect this process with whatever we have. If we care about the Middle East, we need to protect the one process that has been on the tracks right now and moving slowly forward. And if, as the Middle East Treaty Organization, we manage to get to those states, to talk to those states, to introduce the draft treaty. It wasn't fast, it wasn't easy, but to introduce solutions, then we expect the rest of the campaigners that care about the Middle East is to support solutions and not to continue the same language as the governments used for so many years that actually stuck it. And for that, I was a bit resentful at the question, can the Middle East be nuclear free? Why not? Why is it even a question? Why isn't the question, can the world be nuclear free? I mean, when you look at the Middle East, it's as if you're looking at an irrational place with people that don't know how to make peace. It's like the stories we tell ourselves. And the sad thing is that when we hear the world talking about the Middle East in this way, we are internalizing it. There's so many researchers about how kids that are not white, for example, think that they are less than kids with. I mean, this kind of conversation about the Middle East is problematic, I think. We need to shift now. We need to decide to talk about the possibilities. Of course, the Middle East is going to be, you know, the picture you used where Jeremy Corbyn is on the stage with his hands up at a CND. You said that I thought that was the first time I stood in front of CND crowd. We had a wonderful panel talking about the Middle East. And my question there was, but do you believe it's possible? And most people didn't raise their hands, which is why Jeremy was doing this. Like, yes, of course it's possible. And then slowly more people in the crowd raised their hands. Why would you work so much on something you don't believe is possible? So if we don't talk about the possibilities, if we don't support the people from the Middle East that working on this, we're doing something wrong. And I can tell you, and sorry if it's getting too long, that our next project is to get into a deeper layer. In our next project that started, actually the roots have started at the end of last year, a big group of students from around the world, because as you might know, us in the Middle East, we can't talk directly to each other, which is why we're so heavily needing the international support to our work, to host, to talk, to communicate. A group of students is now doing what we call remapping of the Middle East. Because when we talk about security in the Middle East, it's usually from the Western approach or from the Russian approach, depends who you're talking to. But we don't know ourselves what security in the Middle East means for us. So one of the things that we decided to change is to explore what security in the Middle East means in the state level. What does it mean in the regional level, especially when we're about to face more immigrants, more wars over resources, and what is security means for people that live in the Middle East in different groups. And we hope that it will assist many other international organizations with how they approach the Middle East and with the Middle East.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It's very positive, and I think we get the message about what we should be doing in the peace movement here. Thank you. Emad, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Luckily, Sharon has covered a lot of it, so that's fantastic. Just to add that, whereas in the Middle East, we do have some restrictions on our civil society and on some forms of democracy, there are some levers that our friends in the UK and elsewhere have that we don't. So there, here is the influence you guys can have on what Sharon mentioned, the UK foreign policy, the UK's way of dealing with the governments in the region. The fact that it's becoming extremely and continuously hypocritic, and we can see it now through when the British support the dictatorships, the wars, and the means of war that is flooding the region. That's been covered. But it is important that we also, from civil society perspective in the UK, really lead on this to change the policies, the foreign policies of our governments towards the region, because that will actually have an influence. And like it or not, the UK and the British have had a long history of colonization and influence that is well entrenched in the region. And that can be, again, an opportunity to change some policies from the government's inside and to contribute to disarmament. But at the moment, it seems like profits, greed, and making sure that there is more blood coming from the region, and it's the way that it's been continuing. So I hope that being said, that we do focus on the governments in the West to change their policies towards the region, and by extension, civil society engaging more with those from the region that are finding solutions that are tailored and molded with the realities that are happening on the ground. Thank you again for your time.
Thank you very much. I can't see any more questions in the Q&A just at the moment, but I was wondering whether you could say anything about the possibility of a role of the OSCE maybe in this, or a similar kind of organization to be constructed to help with these particular, this particular issue. Do you think that's there's a possibility there somewhere?
Sorry, I didn't get the name of the organization. The help.
Well, something like the OSCE, the Organization for Security in Europe. It's the one that includes Russia and so on.
Well, Dave, there is, when we talk about the Middle East Treaty Organization, we didn't focus it only on disarmament. That's why we call it the Middle East Treaty Organization, because we believe that ultimately WMD free zone in the Middle East is only a gateway, only a start to a much broader discussion on regional security, on human security, on where we can find cooperation on really urgent matters of climate, of water, of migration, immigration, and there is so much at stake here in the region, and we've got to find as many bridges as possible. And the reason why we are as hopeful as we are is because we look at Europe and we saw the carnage in the First World War, the Second World War, and we now see the Germans and the French are all nice and cozy together. So we don't actually, by extension, see an exemption that Middle East is somehow special or different. We actually see much more common ground amongst us in the Middle East than we see between the Europeans. So in a sense, we have a long-term vision of a Middle East union, of one that actually addresses all of these matters collaboratively, through cooperation, through partnership, through dialogue, through diplomacy, and so that we can put an end to this crude way of resolving our differences, because conflict can happen at all levels, between partners to between governments, but it doesn't have to be resolved through violence. So we agree that there is conflict, that there's disagreement, but all we're trying to do is to push for dialogue, diplomacy, since most probably we invented diplomacy and bartering and trade somehow in the region. So we are well versed on how to do this. We just have to remind ourselves that we can do it, and we need the help of others to nourish those means of communication, means of peace, and not the means of war. Because of course, when you flood the bloody region with arms, what the hell do you think they're going to do with it? Play football? No, they're going to shoot at each other. So we need to change these guns into other ways of human development, on thinking about our ecosystem, thinking about, I know it sounds hippie, but I'm going to, by extension, add this, that it's love. It's a fact that like Muslims, Jews, and Christians, and Arabs and Iranians begin their greetings always with peace. It's salam, shalom, and salam alaikum. I mean, come on. This has been ingrained in our language, in our culture, in our history. So for heaven's sake, if you give the region a chance, if you give it, fuel those parts of it that can actually bring about peace and stability and security, oh, we are ready. And we've got the demographic, we've got the vision, we've got the energy. We can do this thing. And I hope that you help us along this journey.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Excellent. We've got a couple more questions now coming up in the Q&A. One from Jenny, which is kind of relevant to what you've just been saying. In terms of changing the narrative and building trust, is there a regional conversation to be had about economic cooperation, tackling climate change and the pandemic, those kind of issues? Is that a possibility? Sharon, do you want to tackle that one?
I can. I don't think if there is a conversation, it's not enough. And it might be between several states, but it's definitely not regional. But also we need to remember that the region or regional discussion is a bit forced because the Middle East is a very strange area if you look at the map. I mean, it's just a decision that this is a zone, the Middle East. So on some things, we don't even see ourselves as a zone. I mean, the way that we think is not like, I mean, okay, UK and Europe is a bit problematic now with Brexit, but it's not like Europeans. They have a line. This is Europe. This is their identity. This is their problems. With the Middle East, we're not even at this discourse. You have the Arab League, you have Iran, you have Israel, and you have some other states that are not sure if they're part or not part of the Middle East, like Turkey, for example. Some people are sure that it's part of the Middle East. Some people think it's Europe. Some people know that it's not really Europe, but it's easy for NATO to have them there. So I don't see how this conversation is happening now in a way that we would like. One of the reasons that we said the Middle East Treaty Organization is a good getaway is because one of the only things that they all agreed to at least discuss on is the weapons of mass destruction. They're all in the room for that. And if you start in that, and when I say all, I also mean Israel, by the way. Israel was in several rooms. It just had to be rooms that are not part of the UN. I mean, Israel always had conditions on in what conditions they are in the room. So all the states are in the room talking about weapons of mass destruction. And if they're talking about weapons of mass destruction, then they have to talk security. And if they're talking about security, how can they not talk about climate change at the end? And what climate change brings with it, and water security, and then human security, which is why we're getting ready. No, they're not talking about it yet, but we want to be there to enforce this conversation.
Yeah, thank you. Another question from Linda Rogers. If we want to host the students or other meetings for the Middle East Treaty Organization, can we contact you for consultation? And am I understanding the proposition? It would be brilliant.
Sure, you can also join METO. I mean, we're an international organization. We're working on weapons of mass destruction free zone for the Middle East as part of a global disarmament idea. And vast majority of our students are not from the zone yet, which really helps us because that's why they can research in the Middle East. But they're doing it with us. And if you have students that want to do things with our university network, you're very welcome to it. And of course, we would love to give any advice, and you can just join our newsletter and know what we're doing. Emad and I are talking to students from university all around the world. Yeah, sure.
Great.
With pleasure.
There's a lot of good going on. And the students actually came up with this amazing thing called the Bright Side. They would go on our website and check it out, which is basically good news coming out of the Middle East. And you know, all of those things that we're talking about is the cooperation on water, on climate, on other things. Yes, there is. Yeah, they don't make the headlines because they're not bombs and blood, but it's happening at the grassroots level, even between governments. And again, we want to showcase that when you look at the Middle East, don't be hopeless. Don't think of it as this, you know, this quicksand that nothing actually is going to stay. If we can be hopeful, you can be. If we can see a better future, you can see a better future. And we need to have an alternative vision to really embrace and make it that is real today. I just want to make sure that I make this message very clear. The fact that Sharon and myself, an Israeli and an Iranian, can work together, you guys have to understand, this is not a joke. We both put our necks out for this. We both come under a lot of stress, a lot of difficulties with some entities within our own communities, within our own governments who want to silence us. The fact that we are working together and we have British, Russians, Americans, and others involved in it, it is the, what do you call it? The something in the pudding, the evidence in the pudding.
The proof is in the pudding.
The proof is in the pudding. I mean, when an Israeli and Iranian is working together, for heaven's sake, what else do you need to show that it's possible?
And we haven't killed each other yet.
Hula. And yeah, we fight too, but we fight peacefully. Okay, most of the time, especially now that it's online.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you. Yeah, I think it's a good example to all of us about how people can come together on particular issues that are really important, even if they don't agree with everything or they have different backgrounds or whatever.
It's important to also note that not just that it's an Iranian and Israeli working together. Everybody now knows that we're working together. At the beginning, we kind of hid it. There's no need. Yeah, it's not the safest, especially for Emad to go back to Iran, I guess. Of course, the Israeli government is not too happy with the draft treaty or with its success. But at the end, its success meant that the Middle East Treaty Organization, meaning Emad and I, the Iranian and the Israeli, got a room at the November. We have a seat at the November conference as observers, which is unheard of. I mean, I'm an Israeli, and the Arab states were voting yes for us getting into the room when they said no to most of the international organizations that approached. So it is new, and the way that the discourse has changed is new and something that we need to protect. But also our solution. I mean, our solution is not just for nuclear weapon free zone in the Middle East, is for a weapon of mass destruction free zone, meaning we are creating a mechanism of compliance for all three kinds of weapons biological, chemical, and nuclear, and the ability to talk about this when actually there's no even a mechanism of compliance for biological weapons that the states agree to. So, so I think it's important to remember that what we are creating here is something that is new to the rest of the world too, and we're not having all the answers. But in the Middle East, we are creating something that doesn't exist yet elsewhere, and we're inviting you to be part of the discourse, because we're not doing it alone. We are doing it with international experts. We are doing it with activists around the world, and we would love CND to be part of this coalition too.
And we will help you get rid of the nukes in Scotland that the United Kingdom has placed there. Don't worry, we will have a lot of good ideas about doing that. So,
okay, Gary, thank you very
solidarity
much.
to Scotland as well.
Yeah, I think we've already had solidarity from Edinburgh put in the chat.
Yes.
So, I think,
Edinburgh hosted the CND. Scotland was hosting our first ever roundtable on the draft treaty, and we will never forget how wonderful it was to sit with all the participants around one table in beautiful, beautiful Edinburgh.
I would have loved to been there, but your government didn't give me a visa. I'll just whisper that. But I'm working on it. Yes.
well, that's wonderful. Thank you. I think
Thank you.
Kate has put in the chat, I think we should be part, that is CND, and I think everybody here will certainly agree that we have also always been very positive on trying to help the Middle East become a nuclear weapon-free zone, and we'd like Europe to become a nuclear weapon-free zone too, of course.
Lead by example, by all means.
Absolutely. Well, whichever comes first, it doesn't matter, as long as one or both of them do. So thank you very much for joining with us in this session. I think unless there's another. No, I can't see any other questions. It may be, I think you've done such a brilliant job, and you've been so enthusiastic and passionate about what you're doing that it's left people with nothing much else to say, I think, except
That's a very nice way of saying it. Other than for the fact that I couldn't stop talking.
That's good. Sometimes Sharon is good, especially with my bad internet. You got lucky. I can't even put my face down. I mean, imagine if I had my face on this thing.
Yeah, well, thanks again, both. I think probably if we stop now and have a quick break, we can finish early. Start early for the next session, which I hope you'll be able to join us for as well and contribute to. So that will be, I don't know, anybody got any suggestions about when we restart?
That'll be 3:30.
3:30. Okay.
Yeah, sounds good.
We'll restart at 3:30. And thanks again to the speakers. Thanks for your questions. And let's carry on with this conversation. It's been brilliant so far. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
this one.
Welcome, Lindsey.
Hi. Hi, everyone. Sorry, it's all a bit late. I had a bit of trouble getting on, but hi, Sarah.
Do you tell me when we start, or shall I start now? Okay, well, welcome back, everyone. Croeso yn ôl for the third session. We've had two superb sessions this afternoon, both informative and inspiring. And this is our final session of the webinar. My name is Jill Evans. I'm the chair of CND Cymru, Wales, and was a member of the European Parliament for over 20 years. And during that time, I worked on the Palestine delegation. Can I ask, as others have done earlier, that if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A. So as this is a shorter session, we won't have so much time, but I hope we will be able to cover all of your questions. We have two speakers, Lindsey German, the convener of Stop the War, which has done excellent work both in informing and in mobilizing people, and Sara Medi Jones, who is the campaigns director of CND, and many thanks to Sara for organizing this webinar and for much more, all the work that she does for CND, of course. So can I ask Lindsey first to look at what next, what we do now as campaigners for peace in the Middle East?
Thanks very much, Jill, and it's really good to be here. I notice there's a whole number of friends and colleagues that I've worked with over the years, including yourself. So good to see everybody. And I just wanted in this session, and I'm sure you've covered so many of the issues concerning the Middle East earlier in the sessions, but I wanted to try to put forward a few points about what I think we should be doing next. And I suppose in all of our minds, and I guess people have probably referred to this already, is the immediate danger of war in Ukraine. And that's important for us to oppose. But I think for all of us who've been involved in campaigning against nuclear weapons, who've been involved in campaigning against wars generally and campaigning for peace, the Middle East remains a constant, really. If you think about the threats to peace, if you think about the instability that has been created there. And I think we have to look at this in several kind of different registers, I suppose. The first is that the intervention of what I would call Western imperialism in the Middle East has been of fundamental importance in terms of shaping the region, and it has had a very, very big impact on the lives of the people of the region, and also on the politics on a much, much wider scale. And I'm particularly thinking when I talk about this, obviously you can look the points after the First World War with the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the way in which France and Britain in particular carved up the region and created its own sort of spheres of influence in the region. But of course, the period after the Second World War as well, when the increasing importance of oil as a commodity has led to great deal of intervention from US imperialism, and also the very, very strong kind of alliances, for example, with Saudi Arabia, the creation of the State of Israel after the Second World War and everything that resulted from that, and the displacement of the Palestinians. These are all incredibly big questions that I think we need to consider when we're looking at the prospects of what can happen in the future, and what it is we want to concentrate on. And so I think we have to always have that as our background, not as explaining absolutely everything that happens in the region, but we have to see this not as a series of sort of accidental and disconnected conflicts and flashpoints that we've seen so many of in this region, but actually very much connected to the policies of the wider imperialist powers. So that's really the first point I wanted to make. Secondly, to kind of concentrate for a moment on the British government, our own government, I think it's worth looking at the British involvement, and you can take this if you want to from the involvement in the coup against Mossadegh in Iran in 1953. You can look at it in terms of what's currently, or you can look at the British role as which had the mandate for Palestine in the years between the First and Second World Wars, or you can look at the current conflicts. We have a war in Yemen, which is generally recognized to be one of the worst humanitarian disasters in the world, and one which the British government has a great deal of responsibility for. It does so in two ways, in terms of the firstly, its general support for Saudi Arabia, which is a major aggressor in the war in Yemen, which is receiving weapons, and not just weapons, but military advice from special advisors who are there to from British armaments firms who are there to actually ensure that the Saudi intervention in the war is as successful as possible. So we have a very great responsibility there over the war in Yemen. Worth remembering as well, this was also a British colony until 60 years ago. So, you know, very, very big involvement there. If you talk about the present situation in Iran, our government has sided usually with the United States in terms of its attitude towards Iran, and particularly with the conflict over the nuclear deal and the way in which Iran has increasingly been singled out for sanctions and for other forms of economic attack on it. I think the British government plays a very big role there. Thirdly, we should look at the whole legacy of the war in Iraq, which is nearly 20 years ago now. It was one which I know everybody here, and again, a number of people, I think including Jill and myself and various other people Kate demonstrated and spoke and did everything we can to stop that war in Iraq. We're still living with the consequences. We're still living with the consequences of the country destroyed and the wider political ramifications of the instability and so on that marks the legacy of the war in Iraq. So third point there, and the fourth point, which I wanted to highlight, perhaps especially, and again I think it's something which is very dear to the hearts of many of us, is the situation of the Palestinians. We've had not just the original Nakba in 1948, and displacement of the Palestinians, successive conflicts involving Israel attacking, whether it's Gaza, whether it's the West Bank, and increasingly, as we've seen in recent years and in recent months, particularly since Donald Trump was president of the United States, a much more aggressive policy in support of the Israeli settlers who are settling quite illegally, the attempt to settle in Jerusalem itself and the whole conflict that has arisen around Sheikh Jarrah in recent months, and the fact that the Palestinian movement is such a big movement in this country and so important for us all, I think, is to do with a very widespread recognition that this is one of the great injustices of international politics, if you like, and that it's important that we do everything we can in solidarity with the Palestinians. Now, that means direct campaigning. We have on the 14th of May, Palestine Solidarity, supported by CND and Stop the War and various other organisations like the Muslim Association of Britain, are having a demonstration to commemorate the anniversary of the Nakba. And I think one of the main things that we can do is to ensure that that is successful as possible, while also continuing the whole question of BDS and the way in which we can highlight these injustices through trying to campaign for boycott, disinvestment and sanctions and so on. So those are very important things that I think we have to do. We have to have solidarity with the people of the region. We have to do what we can over Yemen. And on the 26th of March, we'll be having an international solidarity event, an online event, in support of the people of Yemen and against the war that has been going on now for 7 years. So there are all those things to do. But I think just the final point I'd like to make is when we talk about this in being in different registers, I think that we can also, when we talk about solidarity with the Middle East, we also understand that we can join up the dots, that it's not totally separate from what's going on with the new Cold War in China. It's not totally separate from the present crisis over Ukraine. It's not totally separate from any of these things, because it is our government, the United States government, the EU, are all major players in deciding the politics of the Middle East. And that's, frankly, isn't right. It should be for the people of those countries themselves to decide how it is they want to live and how they want to be governed. So I think our general campaigning for peace, our general campaigning against nuclear weapons, our general campaigning against war helps us, whether it's directly over those particular issues or whether it's over other issues that arise. I think that helps us to show solidarity with the people of the Middle East. And I think one of the biggest things that we can do as people, as citizens of a country which has such a record of imperialism and particularly interference in a whole range of countries in the Middle East, is we have to increase that solidarity and try to find ways of making it concrete when we talk about how we organise against war. So those are my thoughts. Thanks very much for listening, and I look forward to hearing what Sara has to say.
Thank you very much. Sara?
Hi everyone. Yes, diolch Jill. Thank you, Jill. What Jill didn't actually mention there is that we used to work together in the European Parliament, and I have fond memories of us both visiting countries in the Middle East together on official visits. And it is an incredible part of the world, which I love for its people and its culture. And so the focus of this conference today and these campaign issues resonate even more because of that. So this panel, it's campaigning for peace, campaigning for a Middle East without nuclear weapons. What do we do next? So Lindsey has covered the wider issues we will need to address in the future as a peace movement. So I will concentrate more on efforts to make the region nuclear free and how this can contribute to wider efforts for peace in the region. Now, I do think it's crucially important for our work as UK-based campaigners to be in support of the work of the campaigners from the region themselves, first and foremost. We must be led by what's happening on the ground in the Middle East itself and support that. It's not for us to impose solutions from the outside. So much of our role, therefore, rests in putting pressure on the UK government, on our government, who, as we've heard a few times today, bears so much historic and current responsibility for the situation in the region. Now, the history of creating a weapons of mass destruction free zone in the region has been spoken about a fair amount today. And almost half a century after such a zone was first proposed, the need is as urgent as ever. C&D actively supports the establishment of a WMD-free zone in the Middle East and see it as an increasingly important step in the struggle to achieve the peaceful settlement of disputes in the region. Sharon referenced in the last session the 2015 Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference, which ended apparently on a disagreement over such a zone in the Middle East. But I think it's quite obvious to all of us here today that there are many other issues with the treaty in which 5 nuclear-armed states committed to disarming 50 years ago. But here we are today with all the nuclear states nowhere near getting rid of their weapons and actually all modernizing and developing their arsenals. So I think it is a positive development that since that conference in 2015, the new international initiative has been launched to focus on this topic, an initiative which should put the Middle East countries themselves in the driving seat. But Sharon mentioned difficulties the UK created at the last conference and the work C&D could do in encouraging more constructive engagement from our government. Now, along with Kate Hudson, C&D's General Secretary, who we heard from earlier this afternoon, we both met with UK civil servants working on this topic. And they were actually very positive about the conference and the ongoing process. But obviously, from knowing what happened in the room, there is much more lobbying that we can do. And the constructive ideas from the last session, which will help C&D in these regards. But one thing the British civil servants said was the importance of ensuring that this event doesn't turn into an annual conference with just the same statements and vague hopes repeated. This is a really important point, and I think the UK government itself has to take some responsibility in making sure this doesn't happen. As we know, Israel and the USA didn't attend these initial conferences. An actually useful role for the UK would be to put pressure on these two countries to come to the table using its diplomatic means. There are already 5 large areas in the world that have been designated nuclear weapons free zones. That's Central Asia, Latin America and the Caribbean, the South Pacific, Southeast Asia and Africa. These are examples of what can be achieved with collective determination. Enormous challenges face the process, of course, and it might be incredibly difficult to imagine an agreement in the short term. But as long as dialogue is ongoing, and governments like the UK that has a stake in the process supports this, the possibility remains. Another absolutely crucial issue for anti-nuclear campaigners is the steady unraveling of the Iran nuclear deal. Or I saw someone in the comments ask earlier, what did we mean by JCPOA? Well, this is the official name of the deal, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. So this sort of breaking down of the agreement started with US withdrawal in 2018, at a time when Iran was in full compliance. The other JCPOA signatories, including the UK, must step up to the plate and not allow the US to bully them into the destruction of a crucial diplomatic achievement that has done so much to resolve a long-standing and contentious issue. The UK government should do all it can to save the deal at the talks, which are intermittently ongoing. So in general, overcoming the significant obstacles in place to make the Middle East a nuclear weapons-free zone will require a lot of diplomatic work, but the benefits to the whole world would be huge. Nuclear weapons are horrific weapons of mass destruction that threaten the lives of millions. And steps towards ensuring this region, and indeed any region, is free of these weapons must be a priority for the whole international community. And ultimately, of course, the UK has to live up to its own responsibilities. It cannot call for a nuclear-free Middle East without being a hypocrite, unless it starts to take its own commitments to disarm seriously. As we know, the UK committed to working towards disarmament in the NPT in 1970, but we see the government now announcing it wants to build more nuclear weapons rather than less. And it steadfastly chooses to boycott a new treaty that's supported by most of the world's states. The Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which entered into force last year could play a crucial part in achieving a world without nuclear weapons, including in the Middle East, but yes, across the world. The UK government repeatedly says it supports multilateral efforts for a world without nuclear weapons. But what is more multilateral than a treaty supported by most of the world's states? I think it's interesting to note that despite most Middle East countries supporting the treaty coming into existence, it is only Palestine from the region that has officially signed so far. Countries here and elsewhere need to be reassured that this is a worthwhile endeavour, and this can only happen by the nuclear-armed states engaging, and for this to become a truly international effort, not put the focus on specific countries. This is why C&D is calling on the British government to attend the first meeting of the treaty state parties, due to take place in Vienna this summer. Nuclear-armed states have to lead by example and show it is serious about calling for a world without nuclear weapons. Campaigning begins at home, and if we in the UK want to see a Middle East without nuclear weapons, we have to lead by example, get rid of ours. At the same time, efforts to establish a weapons of mass destruction free zone in the Middle East must be supported constructively. The role of nuclear weapons in causing instability in the region must also be incorporated into wider discussions on securing peace in the Middle East and made a part of the general discourse, not seen as a standalone issue. Disastrous wars in Syria and Yemen rage on. Foreign military intervention in Iraq and Libya has resulted in upheaval, and there is no settlement in sight to the conflict between Israel and Palestine. And despite what we heard in the first session, there is actually plenty of constructive ways the UK could be contributing to international security, and it is our job as campaigners to remind the government of this. We need to keep pushing for the solutions to the issues we've discussed today, but also not forget the role the UK plays in nuclear proliferation by refusing to take its own commitments to getting rid of Trident seriously. So finally, I'll just end by saying what others have said today. Get involved with the campaigns. We need to show solidarity. We need to join C&D or other organisations that are working for peace. And as a first step in that, thank you everyone who has joined us today. I hope to see you at future events and campaigns in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sara. I've looked at the Q&A and I see that there's a couple of questions relating to political parties. I don't want to go into detail about specific parties, but in terms of lobbying and solidarity work and campaigning work, how do you feel about the role of the political parties and their positions, and should we be doing more to work with them to get them on side and get them campaigning more? Lindsey?
Yes, I think we certainly should. I mean, in terms of the direct questions, I'm afraid I don't know exactly what the Green policy is on the current crisis in Ukraine, but it wouldn't, you know, I know the position of the Greens in Germany is not good. They're in the government and it's not good. So I hope that there's many people in the Green Party, as I'm sure there will be, who oppose that kind of position and who join with us. The question that's been raised about Labour as well, I think is, you know, of concern. Keir Starmer last week attacked the Stop the War Coalition, and you have to see this as partly a distancing from Jeremy Corbyn, but partly preparing for the possibility of war, and therefore trying to discredit people who campaign against war as at best naive and, you know, at worst sort of willing tools of Russia and so on. And I think what's very, very important is that in this case, and Ray raises the question of attitudes towards Palestine in the same that people are accused of being anti-Semitic for supporting Palestine. I think there's two things we ought to remember. Is firstly that many, many Labour members do not agree with the kind of positions that are put by the current leadership and very much do endorse the kind of views that we would put about nuclear weapons, about Palestine, about war in general. I think the second thing that we ought to be aware of is that we can make a big difference in terms of changing opinion. If you look at public opinion, it's pretty good in this country on a whole range of questions to do with war and peace, and to do with the present conflict, and to do with the Middle East as well. And I think that's a credit to what we've all done sometimes over decades, in terms of bringing these issues to wider attention. And I think we have to continue to do so. I think it's very important that we get resolutions through trade union branches over these questions, that we get them through CLPs, that we raise them through public meetings and campaigning and stalls and all the other things that we can do, because people are faced with an onslaught of, for want of a better word, propaganda over any conflict that arises. We see it over the Palestinians, we see it over Yemen, we see it over Ukraine or China or anywhere else. And I think if we can get our argument out there, it makes a huge difference to not to winning over everybody, but to having a very strong body of opinion, which is organized, which is articulate, which is able to say, no, hang on a minute, this isn't right about NATO. This isn't right about what Israel is doing, what the settlers are doing. And, just keep on doing this. And I know it's, we get fed up with doing this sometimes, but the truth is that's what we had to do over South Africa. It's what we've had to do over so many campaigns over the years. And I think it's very important that we do commit ourselves to doing this kind of activity.
Thank you. Sara?
Yeah, so Lindsey mentioned opinion polling there. So C&D commissioned opinion polling last year, and 68% of Labour Party members support the UK signing the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. I mean, that's a huge amount. And it was 50% of Conservative Party members, which is astounding, really. So opinion polling and just the general public opinion can be much more positive than sometimes it's given credit for. And on a very practical note, in answer to Jill's initial question, yes, organising within political parties is hugely valuable work. And within C&D, we have a very active Labour C&D section in particular, which works to change Labour Party policy, that very nuanced work of going through policy commissions, etc. They work on that kind of issue. And they had a success at the Labour Party conference just gone in September, where the Labour Party policy officially now is to oppose the military deal between America, Australia, and the UK, the AUKUS deal, which is about sharing nuclear material. So of course, what the leadership does with that is another step entirely, but successes are there for the taking. It's just about organising. And if you're a Labour Party member and a C&D member, there's Labour C&D. If you're a Green Party member, there's a Green C&D, there's an SNP C&D. So it is about, there's many different levers of campaigning. There's being out on the streets, talking to people. There's also this work within parties and within trade unions. So yes, definitely, that's a hugely valuable way of getting our message across.
Thank you. There's a specific question. Should we have a public campaign on the Iran nuclear deal as a way of showing anomalies in our nuclear power and nuclear weapons treaties? Sara, first.
Yes, I mean, I think when Trump withdrew, it was President Trump at the time, withdrew from the deal back in 2018. There was a big campaign by C&D and Stop the War as well, where we highlighted what was happening here. But it's definitely important work going forward, because for people who might not be aware, the deal is hanging on by a thread, and there are meetings happening where things get agreed, but then things don't get agreed. So yes, that's definitely something for C&D to look at, maybe to highlight the profile of that deal further.
Thank you. Lindsey.
I agree very much with Sara. I think it is something that we need to highlight. And of course, it's become a little bit lost in the various other things that have been going on internationally in the last few months. But that doesn't mean it's not there. And as we know with all these things, there's a kind of dynamic that once it's set in motion, there's all sorts of things that happen that we need to be aware of and we need to be opposing. And I think this is very, very much the case with the Iranian situation. So yeah, I agree very much with that question.
Good. We are drawing to the end of the session. There was a specific question, Lindsey, for you to repeat the details of the Yemen event and any other events you have coming up.
It's the Yemen event is March the 26th, which is there's going to be an international solidarity event online. There may well be protests locally. As people know, there's Yemeni communities in a whole, it's a very long-standing community to do with the colonies and to do with seafaring. So, for example, in Cardiff and in Liverpool and parts of Yorkshire and Sheffield and Scunthorpe in Lincolnshire, there's quite sizable Yemeni communities, and some of them have been mobilized around this question. On the 26th, there will be this online event, which will be an international meeting with people from around the world speaking, including Yemeni speakers. And the details of that, I don't think are on the Stop the War website yet, but will be. So keep an eye open, but also keep an eye open for local events. There are also some events taking place internationally on the 1st of March. I don't quite know whether there's 2 dates, but there are. And I think that's particularly in the US and Canada. But again, if you are interested in showing solidarity in this particular case, then have a look at those, and we'll be publicising those as well.
Great. Sara, can you draw attention to any specific events that CND have coming up in the near future?
I think just to reiterate what Lindsey said about the May 14th Palestine protest, that'll hopefully be a big demonstration of solidarity with the Palestinians and a good opportunity to bring to the fore that Israel is a nuclear armed state and actually the only nuclear armed state in the region. So that'll be an important event to bring together all these issues and show solidarity at the same time.
Okay, thank you very much. I don't see any other questions. So I think we can draw the session to a close. And I would like to thank all of the speakers, thank CND for organising, of course, thank the chairs and all the contributors, and thank you, all of you, for attending. I'm sure that, like me, you've learned a great deal from our excellent speakers today, and I hope that you are inspired as well to join our campaign for a nuclear-free Middle East and a nuclear-free world. And I would repeat the appeal that you've heard many times this afternoon. If you are not a CND member, please join CND. If you live in Wales, then please join CND Cymru, because we need your support to achieve our aims. And to end on a positive note about a message that we heard earlier on as well, that things can happen. We have to trust and we have to believe that things can happen. This week marks the 40th anniversary of the Nuclear-Free Wales Declaration in 1982, when each of our county councils in Wales declared their areas nuclear-free. 2 of our current councils have passed resolutions supporting the nuclear ban treaty, and so we'll be focusing this year on getting our other county councils in Wales to do the same. So that's something that can give us hope and give us inspiration to carry on. So thank you everyone for an excellent session today. And on behalf of CND and CND Cymru and everyone, thank you very much and good afternoon.